Imagine checking your phone in the middle of the night only to find a text from a friend who's currently thousands of miles away on a classified mission. The text simply reads, "Send help. Nobody is coming." Your heart drops. But before you can even process the panic, a second message appears from the exact same number. Too late. She is already here. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This is the exact, terrifying reality that turned a routine special operations mission into a ghost story whispered in the darkest corners of the military elite. You see, when the world's most lethal operators become the prey, you have to ask yourself, what kind of monster hunts the hunters? The night was dead silent, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that puts every nerve on edge. A specialized six-man team of Navy SEALs was moving through a dense, unmapped jungle corridor along a disputed border. Their mission was supposed to be a straightforward reconnaissance run: observe, document, and slip out like shadows. These men were veterans of the world's most brutal conflict zones. They had survived urban ambushes, hostile desert terrain, and high-stakes hostage rescues. Fear wasn't something they felt, it was something they managed. But tonight, the atmosphere felt completely different. The air was thick with moisture, carrying a strange, metallic scent that made their skin crawl. Every step they took felt like sinking deeper into an invisible trap. The team leader, code-named Viper, raised his hand, signaling an immediate halt. The squad dropped to one knee instantly, weapons raised, scanning the dark perimeter through their thermal night vision goggles. Through the green-tinted lenses, the jungle should have been a map of glowing heat signatures: birds, small rodents, monkeys shifting in the canopy. Instead, everything was completely dark. No heat, no movement. It was as if every living creature in a 3-mile radius had suddenly fled, leaving behind an eerie, unnatural void. Viper checked his tactical tablet. The satellite feed was completely dead, replaced by static. He tried to tune his radio to the encrypted command channel, but all that came through the earpiece was a low, rhythmic scratching sound, like fingernails dragging slowly across a chalkboard. "Command, this is Viper. We have a total comms blackout. Do you copy?" He spoke at a controlled, barely audible whisper. The only response was that agonizing scratching sound, growing slightly louder, matching the steady beat of his own pulse. Viper looked back at his point man, Ghost, who was staring intently into the thick brush ahead. Ghost was the calmest sniper in the entire division, a man who could hold his breath for 2 minutes to take a perfect shot. But right now, his hands were trembling slightly against the grip of his rifle. He wasn't looking at a target. He was listening. He leaned closer to Viper, his voice shaking. "Sir, we're not alone out here. Something is moving with us. It's matching our pace. When we walk, it walks. When we stop, it stops." The team shifted into a tight defensive perimeter, backs pressed against each other, covering a full 360-degree field of view. The silence stretched, becoming so loud it felt like it was crushing their eardrums. Then the temperature dropped. It didn't just get cool, it became freezing cold in a matter of seconds. The breath of the operators began to mist in the humid air. That's when the smell hit them, a suffocating wave of old iron and ozone. Suddenly, a sharp metallic snap echoed from the darkness just 20 yards ahead. It sounded exactly like a heavy branch being snapped clean in half, but there was no wind. Ghost raised his rifle, aiming directly toward the sound. "Movement," he muttered, his finger tightening on the trigger. He adjusted the focus on his thermal scope, trying to find a human shape, a silhouette, anything. For a split second, the static on his lens cleared. What he saw didn't make sense. It was a tall, slender shadow standing completely upright between 2 massive trees. But it wasn't glowing white or red like a living body. On the thermal scope, it appeared completely pitch black, a void of absolute zero, freezing the environment around it. Ghost blinked, thinking it was a glitch in the hardware, a digital artifact caused by the heavy interference. He blinked again, and the shadow was gone. Where did it go? Where did it go? Ghost's voice cracked, losing all military discipline. The other operators looked toward his sector, their heavy weapons sweeping the empty tree line. Calm down, Ghost. Talk to me. What did you see? Viper demanded, grabbing Ghost's shoulder to anchor him. But Ghost couldn't answer. He was staring up into the canopy, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. Above them, the thick leaves began to rustle violently, though the air on the ground remained completely still. The scratching sound in their earpieces suddenly transformed into a low, distorted feminine hum, a soft, melodic tune that sounded like an old lullaby played through a broken speaker. Before anyone could move, a sudden, violent force yanked Ghost directly upward into the darkness. There was no scream, no struggle, just the terrifyingly loud snap of his tactical harness breaking, followed by the sound of his heavy combat boots vanishing into the pitch-black canopy above. "Ghost!" Viper yelled, firing a burst of suppressive rounds into the trees. The muzzle flashes illuminated the leaves for a fraction of a second, revealing a horrific sight. Ghost's rifle was caught in a high branch, dangling by its sling, dripping fresh, dark blood onto the forest floor below. But Ghost himself was completely gone. Viper scrambled for his tactical tablet, desperately trying to broadcast an emergency distress signal through the heavy static. His fingers flew across the screen as he typed the emergency code for immediate extraction. "Send help. Nobody is coming." He pressed send, praying the satellite handshake would hold for just 1 second. He waited for a confirmation, his breath catching in his throat. The screen flickered violently, turning bright red as a single, terrifying notification flashed across the display, sent directly from the terminal of his own missing sniper. Too late. She is already here. Before Viper could even look up to warn the remaining men, the low, melodic humming stopped, replaced by the sound of something incredibly heavy dropping from the branches directly into the center of their tight circle. The heavy thud of something massive hitting the forest floor sent a physical shockwave through the dirt beneath Viper's boots. The remaining 4 operators didn't hesitate. Survival instinct took over, and they opened fire simultaneously, unleashing a deafening wall of sound and lead into the center of their perimeter. The muzzle flashes cut through the pitch black like strobe lights, casting frantic, elongated shadows against the ancient trees. For 3 chaotic seconds, the jungle was filled with the thunderous roar of automatic weapons and the sharp smell of burning gunpowder. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Viper roared, his voice straining against the ringing in his ears. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Smoke rose from the barrels of their rifles, drifting lazily through the cold air. The operators held their breath, their weapons still raised, waiting for the smoke to clear. When it did, the center of the circle was completely empty. There was no body, no blood, not even a bullet hole in the dirt where the impact had occurred. The bullets had struck nothing but thin air. "Where is it? Where did it go?" yelled Doc, the team's combat medic, his eyes darting wildly from side to side. He was a veteran of 2 tours in active war zones, a man who had patched up catastrophic wounds under heavy mortar fire without blinking. Now, sweat was pouring down his face despite the freezing temperature. Before anyone could answer, a wet, heavy splashing sound echoed from above. Viper looked down. A dark, thick liquid was dripping onto the lens of his tactical tablet. He wiped it away with a gloved thumb. It was deep, crimson blood, and it was still warm. Another drop fell, hitting the shoulder of Tank, the team's heavy weapons specialist. Tank slowly tilted his head upward, raising his weapon's tactical flashlight toward the high canopy. The beam of light pierced the darkness, cutting through the rising gun smoke and locked onto a branch 30 feet above them. Perched on the branch, crouching like a predatory bird, was a silhouette. It had the general shape of a woman, but her proportions were terrifyingly wrong. Her limbs were impossibly long and thin, bent at angles that defied human anatomy. Long, matted black hair fell forward, obscuring her face, but through the dark strands, two pinpricks of pale, milky white light stared directly back down at them. She wasn't holding on to the tree, she was fused to it, her elongated fingers wrapping around the thick bark like claws. And wrapped tightly around her distorted torso was Ghost's tactical vest. "Open fire!" Tank screamed, his voice breaking into a panic-stricken yell. But before he could pull the trigger, the entity didn't just move, she blurred. She dropped from the branch with impossible speed, diving straight toward Tank. The flashlight beam caught a glimpse of a pale, jawless face opening impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. Tank didn't even have time to scream. The impact was silent, but devastating. In the blink of an eye, Tank's massive 6'4" frame was lifted completely off the ground and thrown backward into the dark brush with a sickening crunch. His heavy machine gun clattered across the rocks, firing a wild, stray burst into the night sky before going dead silent. "Tank, status!" Viper yelled, sprinting toward the dark thicket where his operator had disappeared. Doc and Raider, the final two riflemen, followed closely behind, their weapons sweeping the shadows. They burst through a wall of thick ferns, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, searching for their fallen comrade. They found him slumped against the base of a massive, ancient tree. Tank's body armor was completely shredded, torn apart as if by industrial shears. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the night sky, his face completely pale and drained of color. But there was no massive pool of blood around him. The deep, jagged wounds on his chest were completely dry, frozen over with a thin layer of white frost. "He's gone, boss. He's gone," Doc whispered, his hands trembling as he checked Tank's carotid artery. "There's no pulse. His body temperature, it's like he's been dead for hours." "Move! We can't stay here," Viper ordered, his survival instincts screaming at him to get his remaining men out of this death trap. "We break for the secondary extraction point at the river, now." The three remaining men turned and began a frantic sprint through the dense jungle. They abandoned all tactical protocols, running for their lives as the suffocating smell of iron and ozone grew thicker around them. The jungle itself seemed to be twisting, the trees closing in, the branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to tear at their gear. As they ran, the low, distorted feminine humming returned, echoing not from the trees, but from inside their own helmets. The encrypted comms channel had been completely hijacked. "Turn off the radios! Disconnect the comms!" Viper shouted, ripping his earpiece out and throwing it into the mud. Doc and Raider did the same, but the humming didn't stop. It grew louder, vibrating directly inside their skulls, a maddening, rhythmic melody that made their vision blur and their heads throb with a blinding pain. Suddenly, Raider, who was running just a few paces behind Viper, stumbled. He didn't just trip, it looked as if his legs had suddenly given out beneath him. He crashed hard into the dirt, his rifle sliding away into the darkness. "Viper! Doc! Help me! I can't move my legs!" Raider cried out, his voice filled with pure panic. Viper and Doc spun around, their flashlights illuminating Raider. He was crawling on his elbows, dragging his lower body through the mud. He wasn't injured, but extending from the dark brush behind him were two impossibly long, pale, skeletal hands, wrapping gently around his ankles. The fingers were caressing his boots with a terrifying, almost motherly tenderness. And then, out of the shadows, her face finally emerged into the light. She had no eyes, just deep, hollow sockets filled with that pale, milky glow. Her skin was a translucent, bruised gray, stretched tightly over a skeletal frame. She looked directly at Viper, her jaw dropping open in a silent, horrific grin. "Hold on, Raider," Doc yelled, raising his sidearm and firing 3 rapid shots directly into the entity's face. The bullets hit with a dull thud, but she didn't flinch. She didn't even bleed. Instead, she let out a piercing, high-pitched shriek that shattered the glass on their tactical flashlights, plunging the jungle into absolute, pitch-black darkness. In the blind dark, Viper heard the terrifying sound of Raider being dragged backward at incredible speed, his fingernails clawing desperately against the dirt and rocks, his screams fading rapidly into the distance until they were abruptly cut short. Viper reached into his tactical vest, pulling out a magnesium emergency flare. With a trembling hand, he struck the igniter. A blinding, harsh red light erupted, casting a bloody glow over the immediate area. Raider was gone. Only Viper and Doc remained. The red glare of the flare hissed loudly, throwing long, dancing shadows against the trees. Doc was hyperventilating, his back pressed against a boulder, his pistol shaking violently in his hand. "We're not going to make it, Viper. She's hunting us. She's playing with us." "Shut up, Doc. Focus," Viper commanded, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "The river is less than half a mile away. If we reach the water, we can move faster. We survive this." But as Viper turned to look toward the path ahead, the red light of his flare revealed something that made his blood run completely cold. Standing just 10 feet away, right in the center of the path to the river, was a figure. It was facing away from them, wearing a shredded Navy SEAL uniform. The name tape on the back of the vest was clearly visible in the red glow. "Ghost." "Ghost?" Doc gasped, taking a step forward, a desperate glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You're alive?" The figure didn't turn around. Instead, its head slowly tilted backward, further and further, at an impossible neck-snapping angle until it was completely upside down, staring at them from over its own spine. The face was Ghost's, but his eyes were gone, replaced by 2 hollow, glowing sockets, and his mouth was stretched into that same wide, jawless, horrific grin. The red flare hissed violently, spitting angry sparks into the damp air as Viper gripped Doc's vest, pulling him back with brutal force. The thing wearing Ghost's uniform didn't walk toward them. It began to move backward, its spine snapping and popping like dry kindling as its limbs inverted, transforming the proud silhouette of an elite operator into a skittering, spider-like monstrosity. "Don't look at it, Doc. Run!" Viper yelled, his voice raw. They tore away from the path, diving blindly into the dense, thorny undergrowth. Behind them, a sound echoed that would haunt Viper for the rest of his days, the wet, heavy slapping of bare skin mixed with the metallic clink of tactical gear moving through the brush at a terrifying, inhuman speed. It was chasing them, but it wasn't rushing. It was keeping pace, just inches outside the fading red glow of the magnesium flare. Doc was losing his mind. Every gasping breath he took felt like inhaling shards of ice. The freezing temperature was dropping even further, turning their sweat into a cold, stiff glaze on their skin. "She's inside my head, Viper. She's telling me to stop. She's using Ghost's voice," Doc screamed, covering his ears with his bloody hands, stumbling blindly over an exposed root. He went down hard, tumbling into a shallow, muddy ravine. Viper slid down after him, his boots digging into the wet clay. The flare was burning low now, sputtering a weak, dying crimson light that barely illuminated the edges of the pit they had fallen into. "Get up, Doc. We're almost there. I can hear the water," Viper urged, grabbing Doc by his tactical harness and hoisting him to his feet. It was true. Through the oppressive silence of the jungle, the faint, rushing sound of a fast-moving river was finally audible. It was their only salvation. If they could reach the water, they could swim downstream, break their scent, and escape the localized blackout zone to signal for air support. But Doc didn't move forward. He stood completely rigid in the center of the ravine, his eyes staring straight ahead into the darkness where the flare's light couldn't reach. "Viper," Doc whispered, his voice suddenly completely calm. The frantic panic had vanished, replaced by a flat, hollow drone that made Viper's skin crawl. "We don't need to run anymore. Look, they're already here to take us home." Viper slowly swung his dying flare toward the direction of Doc's gaze. The red light flickered, casting long, trembling shadows against the mud wall of the ravine. Standing there, side by side, were Ghost, Tank, and Raider. They were standing perfectly straight, attention style, their weapons held across their chests in a flawless military posture. But their faces were completely pale, their eyes hollow, and their mouths frozen into identical wide, jawless grins.
"Step away from them, Doc. That's not them," Viper shouted, raising his rifle, his finger trembling on the trigger. "They say it doesn't hurt, boss," Doc said, turning his head toward Viper. As he turned, Viper saw a slender, pale gray hand with impossibly long fingers gently resting on Doc's shoulder from behind. The entity was standing right behind him, her towering skeletal frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow Doc whole. Her milky white sockets flared with a sudden predatory brilliance. "She just wants to keep us here forever." Before Viper could pull the trigger, Doc's jaw suddenly snapped open with a sickening crack, his mouth stretching wider than humanly possible, mimicking the entity's horrific grin. In a flash of gray motion, the entity yanked Doc backward into the solid mud wall of the ravine. The earth seemed to liquefy for a split second, swallowing both of them whole before solidifying again. The magnesium flare gave one final violent hiss and died, plunging Viper into absolute, total darkness. The silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. Viper was entirely alone. He could hear nothing but the frantic, thunderous beating of his own heart. He was the commander of the most lethal special forces unit on the planet, a man trained to survive any interrogation, any torture, any hostile environment. But against this, his training was completely useless. You cannot shoot a shadow. You cannot outrun a ghost. He forced himself to breathe, slowing his heart rate by sheer force of will. He dropped his heavy rifle. It was dead weight now. Instead, he drew his combat knife with his right hand and his tactical sidearm with his left. He began to back up slowly, keeping his spine pressed against the wet mud wall of the ravine, moving inch by inch toward the sound of the rushing river. As he moved, he felt a sudden freezing breeze pass right over the back of his exposed neck. The air in the ravine had turned so cold that crystals of frost were rapidly forming on the steel blade of his knife. Then came the voice. It didn't echo through the jungle, and it didn't come through his earpiece. It resonated directly inside the center of his brain, using a terrifying amalgamation of Ghost, Tank, Raider, and Doc's voices, all speaking in perfect, horrifying unison. "Why are you running, Viper? A good captain never abandons his crew." Viper snapped, swinging his pistol toward the sound and firing 3 blind shots into the dark. The muzzle flashes lit up the ravine for a fraction of a second, and in that split second of light, Viper saw her. She was crouching directly above him on the lip of the ravine, her elongated limbs coiled like a spring, her jawless mouth opened so wide it split the skin of her gray cheeks, preparing to dive straight down onto him. The muzzle flashes died, and the darkness slammed shut like a vault door. Viper didn't wait for her to land. He threw himself forward, sliding down the slick, muddy slope of the ravine just as a deafening metallic crash echoed behind him. The entity hit the ground where he had been standing a millisecond ago, the sheer force of her impact shattering the rocks and sending a spray of frozen gravel slicing through the air. One sharp fragment tore across Viper's cheek, but he didn't feel the pain. The adrenaline flooding his system was the only thing keeping his heart beating. He scrambled to his feet, lunging blindly through the thick, clawing brush. The roar of the river was louder now, a chaotic, churning rush of water that promised a brutal but vital escape. He could smell the clean, sharp scent of the riverbed cutting through the suffocating stench of iron and ozone. It was right there, just 50 yards ahead, but the jungle wasn't going to let him go easily. Behind him, the sound of her pursuit changed. It was no longer a skittering, spider-like crawl. It was a rhythmic, heavy thudding like the boots of a full squad running in perfect synchronization. The entity was projecting the auditory illusion of his dead team, mocking him, using his tactical training against him. "Viper, wait up! You're leaving us behind!" The voice belonged to Tank. It sounded completely real, filled with the desperate panic of a wounded soldier. Viper clenched his jaw so hard his teeth groaned. He knew it was a trap. He knew Tank was dead, frozen solid in the brush. But the human brain is wired to protect its own, and every elite instinct Viper possessed screamed at him to turn around and fight for his man. He didn't stop. He pushed harder, his combat boots tearing into the moss, his lungs burning as if he were inhaling liquid fire. Suddenly, the dense canopy broke open. The sky above was a bleak, starless void, but the slight ambient light allowed Viper to see the river. It was a churning, whitewater torrent cutting violently through a deep gorge of jagged black rocks. It looked incredibly dangerous, a suicidal leap under normal circumstances. Tonight, it was a sanctuary. Viper sprinted toward the edge of the rocky ledge overhanging the water. He didn't look back. He braced himself to leap, gathering every ounce of strength left in his battered legs. He took his final step, and his boots struck absolute nothingness. A pale, translucent tendril of thick, icy mist had wrapped tightly around his ankle, instantly freezing the leather of his boot and pinning him to the spot. The momentum carried his upper body forward, sending him crashing heavily onto the jagged rocks at the very edge of the precipice. His sidearm slipped from his grip, clattering over the edge and vanishing into the roaring waters below. Viper gasped, his chest heaving as he rolled onto his back, his right hand still desperately gripping his combat knife. The mist around his leg began to solidify, thickening into the unmistakable shape of a long, skeletal arm. Slowly, out of the shadow of the tree line, the entity drifted toward him. She didn't walk. Her elongated, bruised feet hovered just an inch above the frozen dirt. Her long, matted black hair parted, revealing the full horror of her face in the pale ambient light. There were no eyes, just a dark, swirling void within her sockets, and her jaw was completely unhinged, hanging loosely against her collarbone like a broken shutter. As she drew closer, the ambient sound of the rushing river began to fade, replaced by that maddening, low, feminine lullaby humming directly inside Viper's skull. The volume was deafening, vibrating his teeth, making his nose bleed. "Get out of my head," Viper growled, his voice a ragged whisper. He tried to raise his knife, but his arm felt incredibly heavy, as if the very air around him had turned to lead. The entity stopped just inches away from him, towering over his fallen form. She tilted her head, observing him with a strange, grotesque curiosity. Then, slowly, her jawless mouth began to move. She wasn't speaking. She was reshaping the air around her, projecting a voice that was a perfect, flawless imitation of Viper's own wife, thousands of miles away. "You promised you'd come home, Nathan. The kids are waiting. Why are you fighting me? Just let go." The psychological weight of the illusion hit Viper like a physical blow. Tears stung his eyes, freezing instantly on his cheeks. For a single dangerous second, his grip on the knife loosened. The temptation to just stop fighting, to succumb to the freezing numbness and end the terror was overwhelming. But then, Viper saw something else. Behind the entity, standing in the shadows of the tree line, were the silhouettes of his team. Ghost, Tank, Raider, and Doc. They weren't standing at attention anymore. Their bodies were twitching violently, their limbs jerking like puppets on broken strings, their hollow eyes weeping a dark, frozen fluid. They weren't at peace. They were trapped in an eternal, agonizing hell, their consciousness hijacked by the entity to hunt the living. A cold, pure rage erupted within Viper's chest, burning away the despair. "My name is Viper," he spat, his eyes locking onto the milky white glow inside her hollow sockets. "And my team doesn't surrender." With a final explosive burst of energy, Viper didn't stab at the entity's face. He knew bullets and blades couldn't hurt her flesh. Instead, he swung his combat knife downward with brutal force, slamming the heavy steel blade directly into the specialized lithium-ion battery pack of his own tactical vest. The battery pack was designed to withstand extreme combat conditions, but the direct puncture of a high-carbon steel blade short-circuited the unstable core instantly. A blinding, violent chemical explosion erupted right between them. The blast didn't just create a flash of light, it unleashed a massive wave of extreme, white-hot heat and electrical current, instantly shattering the localized freezing zone the entity had created. The entity let out a horrific, ear-piercing shriek of pure agony as the chemical fire scorched her translucent skin, her hold on Viper's leg breaking instantly as she recoiled backward into the shadows. The force of the blast lifted Viper off the rocky ledge, launching his body backward into the open air. As he fell through the darkness toward the roaring river below, his vision began to fade into a dull gray. The last thing he saw before hitting the icy, churning water was the entity standing at the edge of the cliff, her body engulfed in sputtering chemical flames, her hollow eyes staring down at him with a look of absolute, vengeful fury. Then, the freezing water swallowed him whole, dragging him down into a chaotic, crushing darkness. The crushing weight of the Black River dragged Viper down into a chaotic vortex of freezing water, rocks, and raw velocity. The current spun his body like a rag doll, smashing his shoulders and ribs against the submerged boulders. He couldn't tell which way was up. His lungs were screaming, expanding against his chest, desperate for oxygen. Every survival instinct he had left was fighting against the heavy combat gear dragging him down to the riverbed. With a desperate, thrashing effort, he ripped at the quick-release buckles of his shredded tactical vest. The heavy armor slipped away, carried off by the torrent, and the sudden loss of weight allowed him to fight his way to the surface. Viper broke through the water, gasping for air, his throat burning from the intake of river water. The current was moving at a terrifying speed, carrying him away from the high cliff where the chemical explosion had occurred. He looked back through the spray and the dark. The jungle line was a jagged silhouette against the starless sky. There was no sign of the fire, no sign of the entity. There was only the deafening roar of the river. For what felt like miles, Viper floated, using the last remnants of his strength to keep his head above water, steering his body clear of the sharpest rock formations. Eventually, the violent rapids began to widen, slowing down as the river emptied into a massive, stagnant marshland. The current died out completely, leaving him drifting in a thick, murky expanse of black water, surrounded by towering, dead mangrove trees that breached the surface like skeletal hands. Exhausted, bruised, and on the verge of hypothermia, Viper dragged himself out of the water, crawling onto a muddy, roots-tangled bank. He collapsed onto his stomach, vomiting up water, his body shaking uncontrollably from the profound cold. He had escaped the immediate perimeter, but he was completely stripped of his gear. No weapon, no comms, no armor, no boots, just his wet combat uniform and his bare hands. He lay there for a long time, listening. The silence of the marsh was absolute. There were no crickets, no frogs, no nightbirds. The air carried that same heavy, suffocating stillness he had felt in the jungle hours before. Viper pushed himself up onto his elbows, his eyes straining to pierce the thick, low-hanging mist that floated above the black water. Then, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't a roar, and it wasn't a scream. It was a faint, digital beep. Viper froze. The sound was coming from a few yards away, deep inside the thick cluster of dead mangrove roots. It was a rhythmic, repeating tone, the unmistakable emergency tracking beacon of a Navy SEAL tactical tablet. He slowly got to his knees, his bare feet sinking into the freezing mud. He crawled toward the sound, parting the thick, weeping moss with his hands. The beacon grew louder, its green indicator light casting a faint, rhythmic glow against the twisted roots. Viper reached out and pulled the device from the mud. The screen was cracked, but the backup battery was still holding a charge. As he wiped the slime from the glass, the display flickered to life. It wasn't his tablet. The serial number stamped on the casing belonged to Doc. The GPS map on the screen was completely distorted, the blue dot indicating his position spinning wildly in circles. But there was a single text notification blinking on the main interface. It was a file transfer that had been initiated automatically when the device re-entered a low-frequency data zone. Viper tapped the screen with a trembling finger. It was an audio log recorded by Doc's helmet microphone just minutes before the squad was wiped out. Viper pressed play. The audio opened with a heavy burst of static, followed by the sound of rapid gunfire and frantic breathing. Then Doc's voice came through, but it wasn't panicked. It was a whispered, hurried recording meant to be saved in the black box storage of the device. If anyone finds this, if Command gets this telemetry, do not send an extraction team. I repeat, do not send a rescue unit. We crossed into the blackout zone at 0200. We thought it was an enemy jamming signal. We were wrong. It's not a machine. It's a geographic anomaly, a biological entity that shapes the terrain around it. Doc's voice paused, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping against the outside of his helmet. She doesn't kill for food, Doc's whisper continued, his voice cracking with a terrifying realization. She mimics what she consumes to lure the rest of the pack. She's an apex parasite that feeds on tactical behavior. The more you fight her using military protocol, the more she learns your patterns. She knows our formations. She knows our extraction points. She knows our radio frequencies because she's already absorbing them from our minds. The only way to survive is to break the protocol. Do not form a perimeter. Do not... The audio cut off abruptly into a high-pitched, digitized screech that made Viper wince. But the recording didn't end there. After 3 seconds of dead silence, a new voice spoke into the microphone. It was soft, melodic, and entirely human, but it carried a cold, empty resonance that didn't belong to any language. "He is right, Nathan. I know exactly where you are going." Viper dropped the tablet into the mud, his breath catching in his throat. From the dark water of the marsh, just 10 feet from the bank where he sat, the surface began to bubble violently. Slowly, one by one, 5 figures began to rise from the depths of the black slime. They rose perfectly in unison, their bodies dripping with mud and decaying vegetation. Ghost, Tank, Raider, Doc, and a 5th silhouette that was terrifyingly familiar. It was larger, bulkier, its limbs elongated and distorted, its face covered in a layer of translucent gray skin. The entity had fully absorbed his team, integrating their tactical consciousness into her own form. And as the 4 dead operators opened their hollow, glowing eyes, they didn't rush him. They smoothly raised their mud-caked rifles, locking their sights directly onto Viper's chest with a perfect, synchronized military precision. They were using his own team's flawless marksmanship to end him. The 4 dead operators stood frozen in the dark marsh, their rifles locked perfectly onto Viper's chest. The discipline was flawless, the spacing was exact. They were operating under a hive mind that possessed the collective tactical knowledge of the U.S. military's most elite unit. Viper didn't move a muscle. His bare feet were sunk deep into the freezing mud, his chest heaving as the icy water dripped from his uniform. If he dove back into the river, they would shoot him mid-air. If he charged them, a single synchronized burst of 5.56 rounds would tear him to pieces before he could take 2 steps. He remembered Doc's final words from the recording. "She feeds on tactical behavior. The more you fight her using military protocol, the more she learns your patterns. The only way to survive is to break the protocol." Viper slowly raised his hands, not in a defensive fighting stance, but in a gesture of total surrender. He let his shoulders drop. He let his gaze fall from their crosshairs. He completely disengaged his tactical mindset. He stopped scanning for cover. He stopped calculating windage. He stopped acting like a soldier. He became a man who had simply given up. The reaction from the entity was immediate. The 4 puppet operators twitched violently, their rifles dipping slightly as if their targeting programming had suddenly hit a fatal system error. The entity had spent hours tracking a highly aggressive, deeply disciplined prey that responded to danger with fire and movement. By completely removing the aggression and the protocol, Viper had effectively blinded her tactical radar. The central, towering entity stepped forward, passing through the line of dead seals. The water parted around her skeletal legs with a low, hissing sound. She tilted her elongated head, her hollow sockets flaring with a restless, angry energy. She didn't understand why the final piece of her puzzle wasn't fighting back. She reached out with a long, gray arm, her needle-sharp fingers stopping just a fraction of an inch away from Viper's forehead. Viper could feel the intense, localized frost radiating from her skin, turning the sweat on his eyebrows into tiny crystals of ice. A terrifying, intrusive pressure began to push against the front of his skull, trying to pry open his memories, trying to read his next tactical move. But Viper wasn't thinking about a counterattack. He focused his mind on a single vivid memory that had absolutely nothing to do with warfare, coordinates, or survival strategies. He thought about his childhood home, the sound of rain hitting a tin roof, the smell of fresh earth, the warmth of a fireplace. He locked his consciousness behind a wall of pure, mundane human emotion. The entity let out a low, frustrated hiss. The pressure in Viper's head intensified, turning into a blinding migraine that made his ears bleed, but he refused to shift his thoughts back to the mission. Then, the entity did something Viper hadn't anticipated. The puppet bodies of Ghost, Tank, Raider, and Doc suddenly dropped their weapons into the mud. They stepped closer, their pale, dry hands reaching out to grab Viper's arms and shoulders. Their grip was like iron, freezing through the fabric of his uniform. They began to drag him slowly backward, pulling him down into the black, stagnant water of the marsh. "Join us, Viper," Doc's voice echoed from all 4 mouths simultaneously. "It's warm down here. The mission is over." Viper didn't resist. He let his legs go limp, allowing them to pull him into the dark depths. The freezing water rose to his waist, then his chest, then his neck. His vision began to blur as the hypothermia took a final lethal hold of his nervous system. But as his hands drifted through the thick underwater mud of the marsh bank, his fingers brushed against something hard, cold, and metallic. It was half buried in the roots, an old, discarded object completely unrelated to his squad's gear. It was a rusted, heavy iron anchor from a river barge that sunk decades ago, its thick, jagged fluke protruding upward like a hidden spike.
Viper didn't formulate a plan. He didn't use a tactical angle. With a sudden primal scream that used the absolute last drop of his life force, he hooked his right arm under the iron anchor and threw his entire body weight forward, pulling the entity's main skeletal torso directly down onto the rusted iron spike. The heavy, jagged fluke pierced straight through the center of the entity's translucent gray chest. A sound erupted from the entity that wasn't human, wasn't an illusion, and wasn't a mimicry. It was a deafening metallic shriek of raw, physical agony that shattered the remaining glass elements on Doc's tactical tablet and sent a violent tremor through the entire marshland.
The connection broke instantly. The puppet bodies of Ghost, Tank, Raider, and Doc collapsed into the water like empty suits of clothes, their hollow eyes going completely dark as their spirits were finally released from the parasite's hold. The entity thrashed violently, her elongated limbs flailing against the mud as she tried to pull herself off the iron spike, but the rusted barbs held her fast to the earth. Dark, frozen fluid poured from her wound, instantly turning the surrounding water into a solid sheet of black ice. Viper, using the momentum of his strike, dragged his freezing body out of the water and scrambled up the muddy bank, crawling away on his hands and knees. He didn't look back at her screams. He didn't check to see if she was dying. He just crawled, driven by a singular instinctual urge to survive. He pushed through a final wall of thick mangrove roots and collapsed onto a gravel path. Through his fading, blurred vision, he saw two bright, piercing white lights cutting through the heavy mist. It wasn't the entity. It was the high-intensity halogen headlights of a heavily armored military transport vehicle. The vehicle screeched to a halt, the doors flying open as a squad of fresh tactical operators, weapons raised, rushed toward his fallen form. "We have a survivor! It's Viper! Get the medic up here now!" a voice shouted. Viper felt strong hands lifting him onto a stretcher, wrapping his frozen body in heavy thermal blankets. An oxygen mask was pressed over his face. He looked up at the commander of the rescue unit, a man he had known for years. "Viper, what happened out there? Where is the rest of your team?" the commander asked, desperately, leaning close. Viper pulled the oxygen mask down slightly, his lips cracked and bleeding, his voice a barely audible rasp. "Everyone is gone. Secure the perimeter. Do not let anyone into that jungle." The commander looked confused, checking his tactical tablet. "What are you talking about, Viper? We received your emergency extraction signal 10 minutes ago. The coordinates came from right here. The log says your team initiated a full recovery protocol." Viper's heart stopped. He slowly turned his head to look at the tactical tablet in the commander's hand. The screen was completely clear of static. The blue tracking dots for Ghost, Tank, Raider, and Doc were all blinking brightly, moving in a perfect, aggressive tactical formation right behind their vehicle, closing the distance at an impossible speed. And on the screen, a final text notification popped up from Viper's own hijacked terminal, broadcasting to the entire rescue network. "Thank you for sending help. We are coming home." If this story sent a chill down your spine, don't leave your team behind. Hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below with your theories on what truly happened to Viper's squad. Drop a like to honor the fallen, and share this video with someone who thinks they can survive anything. Stay safe out there, because in the dark, you never know who is already listening.